Here's the story of when I drove 2,800 miles over 5 days to get my Dodge Challenger. Hear why I carried a set of wheels and tires halfway across the country, and why this car was worth the trip. This journey begins when I sold my 2016 Dodge Challenger SRT Shaker at the Mecum Collector Car Auction in Kissimmee, Florida. After the auction, I started looking for my next Challenger right away, and this 2015 Challenger SRT in Texas stuck out to me. I've got a history of traveling long distances to get the car I want. I went to Alabama to get my previous Dodge Challenger and to Washington, D.C. to get my Dodge Dart. After getting more information on this SRT from the owner and negotiating the price down to an incredible deal, I decided to pull the trigger and figure out how I was going to get this car from halfway across the country. For reasons I'll go over later, this car was worth traveling 2,800 miles round trip to get, but there were some roadblocks in the way that made it more difficult to purchase and bring back to Charlotte. First of all, the car only had drag slicks on it. These Mickey Thompson ET Street Rs are great for the drag strip, but very unsafe on the street, and you definitely don't want to drive 1,400 miles on these drag tires. I reached out to tire shops in the city of Harlingen, Texas, where the car was located, to see what options were available in 17 by 10, which was the rear wheel size on the car. But literally the only tires available in that size in Harlingen were mud tires, which was definitely not going to work for a 1,400 mile drive. Then I looked into shipping the car, but that turned out to be very expensive. It was going to be at least $1,500 to ship the car and at least $500 for round-trip tickets to and from Harlingen to look at the car before I bought it and shipped it. So that wasn't a good option. So I decided to figure out how I was going to get out to Texas and drive the car back to North Carolina. I knew I couldn't drive back from Texas on the wheels and tires that were on the car, and I knew that I was going to get a set of street tires for the car anyway. So after I finalized the deal with the seller and sent a deposit, I decided to get the wheel and tire setup that I used on my last Challenger. The only problem is I finalized the deal on Tuesday night and was going to leave for Texas on Sunday. And ordering wheels and tires that aren't local, they have to travel by freight, so they weren't going to come in time. Luckily, I found the MRR rims that I was looking for on Facebook Marketplace in brand new, never used condition, and I negotiated them down to half price. But I had to travel to Norfolk, Virginia to get them. So I hopped in my Dodge Dart and drove 11 hours round trip to Norfolk to pick up these wheels. I got the wheels in Virginia on Thursday, and the next day I had the tires mounted and balanced. I went with the same setup that I've used 2 times in the past on my last Challenger, Nitto NT555 G2 summer tires. The wheels are MRR M392 flow forged wheels, and these are finished in bronze. They're 20 by 9.5 up front and 20 by 11 out back. For the front, I went with 275 40 R20s and out back big 315 35 R20s. I used this setup on my last Challenger, and while it was super wide in the back, it did fit. So I figured it would fit on this next Challenger of the same generation. And I later learned that I was wrong. More on that later. Now I had what I needed to start my journey. On Sunday morning, I went to the Charlotte airport and picked up my rental car, a midsize SUV, so that I could fit all the wheels and tires and tools. I loaded the 4 wheels and tires in the car and packed up all the tools I would need to swap the tires once I got there. Jack stands, breaker bar, torque wrench, my floor jack, which I wrapped in an old welcome mat so as to not scratch up the interior of the rental car, and I used a car cover to brace one of the tires from rolling up against the driver's seat. The first day's drive was easy, just 6 hours from Charlotte to Montgomery, Alabama. I stopped for gas on the way in Brazelton, Georgia, and realized I was probably close to Road Atlanta. I've never seen Road Atlanta before, but I'm glad I decided to stop. There was some motorcycle racing happening, which was cool to watch, and I definitely wasn't expecting to see so much elevation change at the track. I absolutely want to do a track day here in the near future. Day 2 was the longest leg, a 14-hour drive from Montgomery, Alabama to Harlingen, Texas. I only stayed in Airbnbs that had garages, and there weren't many options to choose from. And honestly, planning my overnight stops so it was 6 hours the first day and 14 the next day was just bad planning on my part. On that Monday, I drove 1,000 miles through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and finally all the way to South Texas, just a few miles from the Mexico border. Tuesday was the big day, the day I was going to get my next Dodge Challenger. I unloaded all the wheels and tires and tools from the SUV, returned the SUV at the airport in Harlingen, then took an Uber to the owner's house. I looked the car over up and down, did some test drives, and decided to go through with the purchase on the agreed upon price that we sorted out the previous Tuesday. If you're wondering, yes, you can finance a car that you purchased from a private seller. I got a loan from SunTrust Lightstream, and the way this loan works is that once you're approved and you accept the loan terms, they wire you the money, which makes you a cash buyer. So I had a cashier's check ready to go, which I gave the seller, and then I got the car, the keys, and the title in hand. I drove 30 minutes back to my Airbnb, stopped along the way to shoot some reveal video, and luckily it wasn't raining because I was riding on the drag sleighs. I got back to my Airbnb and immediately started to swap the wheels and tires, taking off the Mickey Thompson drag slicks on weld wheels and putting on the MRR wheels wrapped in Nitto summer tires. These 315s on 11-inch wide rims fit on my 2016 Challenger RT, but I put them on this SRT, and to my frustration, I found out that they rubbed on the inside wheel liner very bad. I brought some wheel spacers with me, but they weren't wide enough. Luckily, I sorted through the parts that the seller included in the trunk and found some Eibach 25mm wheel adapters. I fiddled around with a few variations of adapters and spacers, and fortunately the wheels weren't rubbing on the inside anymore, but they definitely stuck out too much. I was worried about the tread of the tire rubbing on the fender, but after a quick test drive, I realized that that was only going to happen when I went over big bumps. And with the adapters and spacers that I had on hand, this was the only way to make the wheels and tires that I brought halfway across the country work on the car for the return trip. I mounted the rear wheels and tires and then moved the front, where I had to figure out some wheel spacer fitment again. After these surprises and delays, fortunately I got all the wheels and tires on the car, did a quick test drive to make sure there was no rubbing, then came back and started the jigsaw puzzle of trying to fit a few hundred pounds of wheels, tires, and tools inside of a Dodge Challenger. I made it all fit, including the 4 drag wheels and tires, with one riding shotgun in the passenger seat for the entire return journey. After buying the car, swapping out the wheels and tires, and then loading up the car with a ton of parts, I then drove 4 hours from Harlingen to Houston, where I stopped overnight. Along the way, as I would go over big bumps, especially over an overpass, I would hit the edge of the tire on the fender. And then I realized that I was in a Challenger SRT and I had adjustable suspension. So the entire 1,400-mile return journey, I put the suspension in track mode, which made the suspension super tight and reduced suspension travel, so that when I would go over a bump, the suspension would squat as little as possible, and it definitely helped reduce bottoming out on the tire. On Wednesday, I drove 10 hours from Houston back to the same place I stayed in Montgomery, Alabama. My old friend John, who lives in Alabama, stopped by. It was great to catch up with him for a few hours. The 5th and final day was an easy 6-hour sprint from Montgomery back home to Charlotte. It was definitely a tight fit for the 20-hour return drive with all those parts riding with me inside the car. But fortunately, even being a built modified Challenger, the car ran great with no mechanical problems. And I was very happy to be back home, to have the trip over, and especially to have my new-to-me Dodge Challenger. It was a long journey and definitely an untraditional way to buy a car, but I definitely think it was worth it. I ended up with a badass Dodge Challenger at what I think is a pretty incredible deal. What I got is a 2015 Dodge Challenger SRT. The SRT was a model launched in 2015 that was basically a Hellcat just without the supercharger. It had every single option available just like the Hellcat, including adjustable Bilstein suspension, monster Brembo 6-piston brake calipers up front and 4-piston out back, a 392 Hemi V8, performance pages, customizable track modes, heated and ventilated seats, lane departure warning, and a ton of other options. This Challenger not only had the plethora of options that come on a Challenger SRT, but also some impressive modifications. These include a Barton short throw shifter for the manual transmission, a Borla Attack exhaust with catless JBA mid pipes, a drive shaft shop one-piece carbon fiber drive shaft with transmission safety loop, and the most important addition, a D1X procharger centrifugal supercharger. This takes the stock 485 horsepower 392 to over 600 horsepower. It's been dyno tuned at over 560 horsepower at the rear wheels. This Challenger is a whole different ballgame from my previous Challenger RT. And not only did I get it for less than half of the original $51,000 sticker price, I bought this beast of a car for less than I sold my previous Challenger for. I love my Challenger SRT, and I love the deal that I got. Friends that know me tell me that I don't do things the easy way, and as you can see, they're absolutely right. Stay tuned on the Track Shaker pages to see how I build this car and get it ready for its debut on the road course. Thanks for watching and riding along.